Have you ever wondered who, what, where, why people came to Western New York? And I don't mean recently, I mean in the very beginning. Today we're going to be talking about Paleo-Indians. That's right, the folks who came here or were here before the Iroquois. Everyone talks about the Iroquois. They've got a great PR team. We hear about the Seneca all the time. But what about the Paleo-Indians, the first humans to be in the Western New York area? We're going to learn all about that on today's State of Greater Western New York report, which is brought to you by... Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard.
The Bend and Honey Lake Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York report, Chris Carosa.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome to today's ultimate edition of the 2021 State of Greater Western New York report. That's right, we're taking a vacation next week. We won't be here, but this week we've got a very interesting panel discussion. It's going to be about Paleo-Indians. Paleo-Indians, what are Paleo-Indians? How do we get that name? What's it all about? We're going to find that out today. We've got two great guests. John Lothorp, he's at the New York State History Museum, and Doug Perrelli. He's with the Department of Anthropology at SUNY Buffalo. He's also the president of this thing. I'll let him introduce each other when they both start. But let's start with John. John, you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in this particular topic.
Well, I'm the curator of archaeology at the New York State Museum, and trying to understand ancient peoples has always been something that's fascinated me ever since I was a child. Took college courses in it, went to graduate school, and ultimately ended up here at the New York State Museum.
Okay, John, great. Tell us a little bit about the area of studies. Maybe we'll pull up a map and you can tell us both in general New York State, where you've been looking at, and then maybe more specifically in the area that our audience is in.
Sure, and so we're going to show some maps here, and one of the things that many people may not be aware of is the incredible time depth of the Native American presence in the New York region and the broader Northeast. It goes back about 13,000 years ago, and we're going to be talking about a handful of sites and artifacts that have from Western New York that help us better understand that time period. But what we're looking at here is a map of the New York near the center there and the Great Lakes around it, and these people that archaeologists call Paleo-Indians, the first Native Americans to come into the New York region, came in the last gasp of the Ice Age, about 13,000 years ago. And this map shows the landscape of the larger region at that time. You can see the glacial ice sheet that was still there a couple of 100 miles north of Buffalo at that time. New York was ice-free, and the presence of that ice sheet changed the plumbing of the Great Lakes. So if you look at Lake Erie today, it wasn't the same size as it is today. Back then, it was actually three smaller water bodies. What's in the Ontario Lake Basin was actually smaller as well, and notably to the north of the Adirondacks there, you see the Champlain Sea. That formed because as the ice retreated back from that dashed line at the bottom of the map, starting around 24,000 years ago. That was the maximum advance of the last glaciation. It began retreating back. The landscape was depressed from the weight of the glacial ice that had been there before, and depressed so much that the Atlantic Ocean flowed up the St. Lawrence Valley and created that Champlain Sea, and that existed until about from between about 13,000 and 9,500 years ago. So a very different landscape from today, and that the lives and lifeways of the people that we're going to be talking about reflect the nature of that landscape. We're now going to go to another image, another map that's going to focus on that area in red. And this is a map of Western New York. And archaeologists identify or try to investigate these people by the locations of their ancient campsites that are marked by stone tools and flakes from sharpening and making those stone tools. And this map shows Paleo-Indian sites in the Western New York region and in adjacent Ontario across the Niagara River. And there are 4 sites, as I mentioned, Ark, Hiscock, Lamb, and Kilmer in Western New York, that have really been really informative for us about how these people were living in this Ice Age landscape. And you see the shape of early Lake Erie and early Lake Ontario at that time, 13,000 years ago. So that's what the landscape looked like. We're going to move on to another image now.
Oops. Before we do that,
yes,
John, let's go back to the map with the glacier, and I think this will lead into that next image you want to go to. Can you describe, say, maybe the paths, the reasons why humans migrated into this region, and maybe where they came from, if that's known at all?
No, that's a great question, Chris. So if we can pull that map up again, what we are pretty confident of, based on multiple lines of evidence now, is that the Native Americans who came into the New York region in the late Ice Age were descended from groups that came across the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska 20 to 30,000 years ago. And that land bridge itself was exposed because during the Ice Age, the sea levels worldwide were lower because so much moisture was locked up in those ice sheets. So that provided a pathway for peoples to cross that land bridge, come into Alaska, and then ultimately migrate south. We're pretty confident that's where the ancestors of Native Americans came from, both based on modern population genetics. If you look at populations in Siberia today, they show similarities in some of their genetic makeup to modern Native American populations. And in addition, most recently, a very important Paleo-Indian site called Anzac in Montana was a burial site, and they reconstructed the genome of that individual, compared it to ancient genomes of individuals living in the Upper Paleolithic 20, 30,000 years ago in Siberia, and they also showed similarities. And this Anzac burial, Paleo-Indian burial, also showed equivalences in some of the genetics to modern Native American populations. So there's a high degree of confidence that that ultimately is where the ancestors of Native Americans came from. How they got into New York, there's a general consensus that they probably, there may have been multiple corridors, but one corridor may have been coming up the Ohio Valley or coming west to east across the Great Lakes and into Western New York. So those are likely corridors for people coming into the region at that time. They obviously would have had to skirt the ice sheet that was still there 13,000 years ago, as well as the ancestral Great Lakes water bodies that were there at the time.
So they followed the animals, and that's probably what drove them here, correct?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to think that the human species, as anthropologists talk about adaptive radiations, and this was one of the last adaptive radiations of the human species. Ancestors of Native Americans coming into the New World, coming through Alaska, Canada, into North America and South America. And New York has an important story, chapter to tell in that larger story. So who were these people and what were their lifeways? This is actually an exhibit at the museum where I work, the New York State Museum, and it's based on excavations the state archaeologists did a number of years ago at a site in the Hudson Valley called West Athens Hill. But I think it's a good model for the early Native Americans that archaeologists call Paleo-Indians, who were coming into the western New York region about 13,000 years ago. As I mentioned, we're in the last gasp of the Ice Age, so the landscape looked quite different. It was spruce forests and parklands. So cold climate tree and plant species. You also had cold climate animal species that today you would see in the Canadian subarctic, and perhaps most importantly for these people was the caribou that you can see in the foreground, this is a herding animal that's migratory, and they would have tried to intercept this animal and kill it both for its meat but also for hide, because if you're living in a subarctic environment like these people were, when winter came you had to have warm skin clothing, and so that's exemplified by the image here. I want to just move on now quickly to some of the calling cards of these people in terms of the artifacts that they left behind and which tell us about how they were living. So on this image here, you're seeing their stone weapons tips. The two examples on the left are unfinished examples, but the ones on the right, they're called fluted points. And if you look closely at this drawing, you'll see a channel going up from the base on each of these points. That's called a flute or a channel scar. And if you find one of those, then you know that you're dealing with an artifact that was made between about 13,000 and 11,500 years ago in this last stage of the Ice Age. They were tipping hunting weaponry with these stone tips to hunt caribou and other mammals. But they also had a range of other kinds of stone tools, as we'll see in this next picture. And I won't go into detail here, but a whole range of stone tools for working hide, bone, and wood. And one of the most common tools is on the bottom left under the letters K, L, and M. Those are called end scrapers. And those are tools that were used for working animal hide, probably animal hide such as caribou, and that would have been a tool that you needed to work that hide to ultimately turn it into clothing that would keep you warm in those subarctic winters. We're going to move on to one more slide, and I just want to the sort of the transition point between what I'm talking about and what Doug is going to be talking about is after the Ice Age, which ends about 11,500 years ago. Other kinds of point forms and stone tools appear, and the ones that you're looking at in this picture are the ones that are labeled A, B, C, and E and F. Those are very similar to stone weapons tips, which were being made on the northern high plains 1,000 miles to the west at the end of the Ice Age. And this suggests to archaeologists that these artifacts may represent a migration of other Native Americans from the high plains into the Northeast and New York at that time. That stone tip, letter D, that's a different kind of stone point. It may be about the same time. It also dates to after the Ice Age, and it relates more to point forms that you see in the Southeast and the Midwest. So this is the transition between what I'm talking about and what Doug is going to be talking about next. Different populations potentially at this time in New York and Western New York. It's actually this time period right after the Ice Age, after 11,500 years ago, is what archaeologists know least about in the state of New York and Western New York specifically. So that's part of what we're trying to better understand.
Well, this is very, very fascinating. Thank you, John. And if you have a question, go to the chat and just put it down. We'll read it. I want to give Doug a chance to talk when we come back to our break, to just give a presentation on what he's looked at or what he's seen. But then we'll want to open it up to some questions from the audience, and maybe get Doug and John to be talking to each other, because I know in the green room when we were talking, they were pretty interesting, just hearing them talk amongst themselves. So we'll break right here. We'll be right back after this message.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
Welcome back to the State of Greater Western New York Report, and we've got a great show today, learning about Paleo-Indians, the folks who were here really for the first time, the first humans in the Greater Western New York region. We're going to turn it over to Doug right now. Doug, tell us a little bit about your background and maybe how you got interested in this subject.
Oh, thank you, Chris. I got started in archaeology when I went to the State University of New York at Geneseo as an undergrad. I didn't grow up thinking I would become an archaeologist, but I took an archaeological field school in my second to last year of undergraduate at Geneseo, and we excavated sites in the Genesee Valley. My professor and advisor was Dr. Wendell Rhodes, who recently passed away. And it was just such a fascinating experience to excavate archaeological sites and try to piece back together that picture of what was happening, what people were doing on the walls and on the floor of the Genesee Valley 1,500 years ago, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 years ago, which matches the dates of the artifacts that we were finding.
So we'll get to the artifacts in a moment, but let's go over the map that you showed me about the sites generally in the Greater Western New York region. Tell us a little bit about them, maybe who the peoples were that were there, and whatever kind of interesting tidbits you think our audience might be interested in.
Sure. Well, what I want to do is pick up where John left off at about 11,500 years ago. And if you could bring up that map. Okay, so this is a bit abstract, but what you're looking at is all of the archaeological sites that we have investigated from the University of Buffalo Archaeological Survey. I'm the director of this Applied Research and Archaeology unit, and we go out in Western New York and do various kinds of projects for various clients and look for archaeological sites. This map represents the things that we've found here over the past 30 or 40 years, I would say. And if you look at all those dots on the map, you can see that they cluster in certain areas. And most of these sites represent something in between the Paleo-Indian period that John Lothorp spoke about and the Iroquoian period, that we know so much more about. So these are the archaeological sites that represent what I would call, in archaeological terminology, the archaic, the transitional, and the early and middle woodland phases of Western New York prehistory. Now, those terms may be offensive to Native Americans today, but they're the nomenclature, they're the labels that we use, and these labels were sort of thought up and presented by the state archaeologist several decades ago, William Ritchie, in his seminal work, The Archaeology of New York State. So we're standing on the shoulders of giants like that. We're trying to add to the picture, and what we have here is a picture of change through time, adaptations to a changing environment, and culture changes over the course of about 10,000 years. Now, you must realize people are going from the Paleo-Indian phase where we have highly mobile bands of hunter-gatherers ranging wildly across the eastern woodlands and throughout New York State. When you think of the next 10,000 years of prehistory, I think you can think of a period of people settling in to river valleys, to regions, to areas of Western New York where they would work, live, and play for their entire lives. And so the mobility of people is becoming less. The foodstuffs that people are exploiting are becoming more diverse and more widely ranging. And so during this 10,000 years that I think about between Paleo-Indian and Iroquoian times, you have people transitioning from hunting and gathering to growing their own crops, to living in villages, to exploiting a whole different series of resources that come on the scene because the environment is changing. You have to realize the environment is changing from one of a post-glacial environment to the environment that we now recognize today. And so with that series of changes through time, through thousands of years, you have people changing their life ways in response to those changes and mapping onto specific food products and specific areas of the landscape.
Tell us how this is reflected in the artifacts that you're showing us.
So one of the questions I posed to John, so this is an assemblage of projectile points, arrowheads, much like the Paleo-Indian stone tools that John showed. But what I think you can recognize are two things about this slide in comparison to those. There's a tremendous amount of diversity in terms of the final shape of the finished tool forms. And what you're looking at in this image on the top are a series of different arrowhead types, a series of different projectile point types that actually represent different periods of time in the prehistory of Western New York. The point in the middle, for example, is what I would refer to as a Lamoka point. It's made out of a local Onondaga type of chert. It's associated with what we call the Lamoka culture, named after archaeological sites investigated by Bill Ritchie around Lamoka Lake in the Finger Lakes region. And what you'll find is a lot of the archaeological cultures are named after place names from across New York State, and that was a convention of Bill Ritchie's back in the day. And so that series of different point shapes you see on the top represents different people, different time periods, and different locations in Western New York. Another thing I would observe is the color of these projectile points is fairly consistent. They're all pretty much gray or bluish gray modeled. That's because they're all made of a local Onondaga chert that is common to Western New York. If you were to look back at the images shown by John Lothorp, you would see a tremendous diversity in terms of the raw materials that were used by those people to make weaponry and tools. That's because, That's because the range of activities on the landscape that these people participated in are really broad ranging. They traveled far, they traveled wide, they took raw materials for making stone tools from all over the eastern woodlands and different areas of North America, unlike the people who are nestled in Western New York, who are settling into the local environment and using more localized raw materials to make their stone tools. I would draw your attention to the two objects in the bottom right of this image. That's a very typical, very classic Onondaga chert. It's sort of a bluish gray mottled material. It comes in raw material in beds in the bedrock of the Onondaga Escarpment. And because of the glacial history of Western New York, this tool stone material in pretty high quality has been churned up by the glaciers, and pebbles and cobbles and fragments of it can be found all throughout Western New York. And those were utilized by Native American inhabitants to make those kinds of stone tools.
Very good. Doug, we're getting some questions in, and I don't know which one of you the questions are most designed for, but the first question that we've got is, explain this transition a little bit more from Paleo-Indian to Iroquoian times. Give some rough, not necessarily dates, but years. So at what point did the Iroquois become transcendent and kind of become the modern Native Americans in the greater Western New York, modern, centuries old?
Well, in terms of a slice of time, we're talking, I would argue that we're talking from about 11.5 thousand years ago to about 900 AD, if you can think of it that way. Prior to about 900 AD, if I can put it in those terms, cultures are developing into what would become the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois-speaking peoples that now and continue to today occupy New York State and live and work and play here. But I would describe it as a series of three major shifts in life waves. After the Paleo-Indian, you have what we clumsily refer to as the Archaic period, and this is a period of time where people start to exploit forest resources. And one of the big hallmarks of that exploitation is the appearance of a particular artifact type known as the stone axe, or adze. This is an example I'm holding in my hand here. It's got a bit of a gouge shape. But one of the things you find during the Archaic period, from maybe 6, 7, 8,000 years ago, is a new focus on the creation of ground stone tools for the purpose of woodworking. That's because the forest succession has occurred. We have the modern forest cover here that we didn't have at the end of the Paleo-Indian phase, and people are starting to make durable stone tools for the purpose of woodworking. I have a number of different examples of those here. They come in various shapes and sizes and different raw materials. Then as we move into what I would call the transitional phase, you start to get a very different group of artifacts. And then you get into the woodland phase, where people are actually starting to cultivate crops and grow domesticated crops, and starting to work with fired clay pottery and things of that nature.
And I think that kind of delves into the next question that we've got, and that is, we're used to the term tribes or clans. When did that community sort of setup first appear?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So I think the thinking is, did the Paleo-Indians come over as a set community already? Were they a tribe or a clan, or did they come up just in smaller groups, and then did they form these communities that ultimately became tribes much later? Actually, that begs the other question: is where did the peoples that were here, did they evolve, or were they themselves being pushed out by new individuals who are migrating into the Western New York region? Or don't we know the answer to that?
Yeah, well, I can talk about that a little, and then Doug can follow up. I think the first peoples that came into New York that would not fit the conception most of us might have of tribe, you have to keep in mind that the population density at this time was incredibly low. There's no way to know what it was, but you might have had 1,000 people living in the entire state of New York in the late Ice Age. So they, as Doug mentioned, they're traveling widely across parts of the state with the season, perhaps because of the animals that they're hunting, as well as to interact with each other. And so they had likely conceptions of themselves as a people, but perhaps not in this concept of tribe that is associated with more sedentary populations. And as I think, as I touched on very briefly, what happened to the people who were making fluted points, we don't know. We can't say with certainty that subsequent Native American groups were descended from them. They were in general for the larger region, but we can't say that for certain for Western New York per se. So that's an open question that we're all trying to better understand. And Doug, I'm sure you want to pick up on this.
Go ahead, and I think after that Paleo-Indian period, where I would call colonists coming in, I think, Chris, what you described, there's a number of different things happening. People are certainly moving around. People are migrating into New York State from points to the south and points to the east. But there are also a number of local developments happening in New York State where people are staying put. They're living in a particular sub-region of New York State, and their culture is developing through time and flourishing.
So would you say that, and here I'm going to ask a question that is definitely above my pay grade. I know there's two kinds of languages that existed. There's the Algonquin language and there's the Iroquois language, and that kind of represents cultural units of the entire, population base of North America, at least northeastern North America. So I guess what I'm asking is this Iroquois language, even though the tribes weren't necessarily what we learn in school to be the 5 or 6 tribes that were in part of the Iroquois Confederacy, culturally, were they all the same? So in other words, the Erie tribe, was that part of the Iroquois culture, so to speak?
Okay, the tribes you're referring to are all part of the same basic language group. But if you're talking about the Erie and the Seneca and the Oneida and the Onondaga, they all spoke variations of a language and were actually somewhat isolated as social groups and developed separate from each other until the Confederacy formed pretty close to the time of contact with Europeans. And so it's an interesting question and an interesting picture of cultural development. But the Iroquois language-speaking people as a group, which appear to be surrounded by Algonquian-speaking peoples, at least when Europeans got here and started to record that kind of history, that pattern is responsible for this idea that Iroquoians migrated into this region and developed a homeland in what is now central and western New York, and probably competed with a completely different language group, the Algonquian-speaking peoples.
So that's a little bit past the timeline we wanted to be talking about today, and we're already over time, but that's okay. This has been fascinating, and we'll probably want to explore something in detail in the future, maybe take a smaller slice of time, because there's a lot of things that, well, like as I said, they just don't teach in school, but it's fundamental to understanding not only our region, but maybe about people in general, and how things moved over time. So John and Doug, thank you very much for appearing on today's show. Audience, thank you for participating. And remember, if you want to be part of the live audience, then just go to stateof.greaterwesternyork.com. You can register there. It's free, and you'll get an invitation to this Wednesday noon show so that you too can ask your own question of our guests. Well, we want to thank everyone for watching today. Remember, we're here live every Wednesday at noon. The show's archived and goes on our site, stateof.greaterwesternyork.com. And then it's re-aired every Sunday at 1:30 on both our YouTube channel and Facebook page. That's it for now. Bye-bye. Remember, we won't be here next week. We're taking some vacation time. And we will see you in the new year. So, bye-bye.